Folks, it's a real pleasure to welcome a person who's been on the political scene for years. And he's the kind of person who, when he speaks, you do an E.F. Hutton and you listen to him. At least I do, anyway. Gregg Jarrett is the Fox News legal analyst and commentator. Before that, and I'm just not going to get into this, but somehow something went wrong with Gregg's life, and he was an anchor and correspondent at MSNBC. But that's that. I won't belabor that point. He's the author of multiple books, including The Trial of the Century, The Constitution of the United States, and Other Patriotic Documents. I love that. The Russia Hoax, The Illicit Scheme to Clear Hillary Clinton and Frame Donald Trump, Witch Hunt, the story of the greatest mass delusion in American political history. You can see that Gregg is on top of the American political scene. So, Gregg, let me ask you first, given your long history analyzing these things, how do you see this presidential race at this point in time? How do you see it going?
Well, I always thought it would be close because, Americans are so divided. And, but Trump was really gaining steam until Joe Biden correctly dropped out. He should have never have run for re-election. But now with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, I think Americans need to examine her record. Because her record is really quite shameful in so many different ways. She was put in charge of the border and did absolutely nothing, and that has wreaked havoc on America, and the long-term damage will last for generations. When you bring in unvetted 10 million people into the country with no plan to absorb, the financial burden on America is really going to be unsustainable on healthcare, on education, on public safety and law enforcement, on housing, on jobs. I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, you're talking about, tens of billions of dollars over the next few years to, provide for this. And it never made any sense. I think Americans are now revolting. And I think that if you look at any of the polling data, that is one of the, primary concerns. The other, of course, is inflation and the economy. And, people's lives have really been ruined by the profligate spending of the Biden-Harris administration at the outset, which triggered inflation. They were told, don't do it. This will happen. It did happen. They didn't care. And Americans are still struggling to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their heads. When they pull up at the gas pumps, they can't fill up their car all the way. And they go to the grocery store and they can only buy half as many groceries. And you hear people say, well, inflation's coming down. Yes, but the baseline is still up at 25, 30%. So it's cooling, yes. But people are still paying more for their basic needs, and their real wages are down. So, I think Americans need to take a look at the record of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. She has adopted most of his positions. Now she's trying to separate herself and walk back. If Americans will actually take the time to examine who the Democrat candidate is, the nominee, who was never vetted because she never ran. She never won a single vote in any primary. She's suddenly anointed. And of course, the national legacy media is now portraying her as a combination of Mother Teresa and Florence Nightingale based on nothing. So, Americans might be fooled it's up to them to do the hard work of examining who the candidate is.
Well, I'm going to give you some numbers, Greg, and you comment on them after I give them to you. But first, let me ask you this. The Democrats say Kamala Harris is, it was never the border czar. The Democrats also say people like Mayorkas looked members of Congress in the face and said the border was secure. And Joe Biden actually blamed Donald Trump for the state of the border today. Are you a liar?
You know,
someone's lying.
The things the vacuous excuses they have offered, as you've just described, are lies. She was in charge of the border, and she did nothing about it. Wouldn't even go down there. And then famously said, "Well, I've never even been to Europe, too." So yeah. I mean,
by the way, that bothered me too.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you want in a president, somebody who is an absolute foreign policy, international relations novice, who probably couldn't identify most important countries on a globe. But yeah, and their excuse for the economy now is, it's price gouging by big corporations. That has been examined over and over again. And it's a lie. It's not price gouging by corporations. It's the profligate spending by this administration that triggered inflation. It's as simple as that. And now they're talking about, wage and price controls. Now, Kamala is too young to remember what Richard Nixon did.
Exactly.
But I'm old enough.
Exactly.
She and I went to the same law school, but I'm considerably older than she is. I'm almost 70 years old, and I well remember the wage and price controls, which failed miserably. What happened? Store shelves began to empty. There was a huge supply problem. It created economic chaos. Nixon made a mistake. And, are we going to make the same mistakes because, Kamala is ignorant and the people around her? Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Okay, so let me give you some numbers here. This is what a national survey that we just took of Democrats to see how much they know about Kamala Harris. Here's the numbers. I'm going to run over a few numbers for you. 71% of Democrats have no idea that Harris supported cutting funding for the police. 73% have no idea that she co-sponsored the Green New Deal. 81% are unaware that she supported eliminating all private health insurance. 71% were unaware that Harris has supported reparation payments to atone for slavery. 72% are unaware that since being named the border czar, she's never been to a conflict zone. 75% were unaware that in 2019, she was named the most liberal senator in America. 74% were unaware that Harris said it should not be considered a crime to enter the United States illegally. This one's a good one. 77% are unaware that Harris supported abolishing ICE. 78% were unaware that Harris promoted a fund to bail out violent protesters during the 2020 riots. Finally, 86% were unaware that Harris would consider allowing death row inmates to vote. What do you think would happen if Democrats did know?
If they did know, they wouldn't vote for her. One of the most important things that you mentioned is law and order in America. And if people knew that she wanted to defund police, she was cheering on the summer of riots, the arson, the vandalism, the looting, the beatings, the assault and battery, and helped fund this organization that was going to give bail money to the criminals. I mean, that is a person who should not be president of the United States. And, you've got this new report out that talks about the kind of prosecutors that Kamala Harris was when she was a district attorney in California and then attorney general in California. This is a person who I believe will not faithfully execute the laws of the United States, including the border. It's illegal and a crime to come to the United States illegally. She won't do it. She'll be just like Joe Biden.
Well, we're going to that report, and now speak as a lawyer. What you think about this? George Soros, under the cover of darkness, with no coverage given to him by any network, has been buying prosecutors all over the United States of America. We got our hands on over 7,800 pages of correspondence between these DAs. What we found is frightening. He has spent over $40 million to elect prosecutors around the country. But even more telling, he has spent, that we've tabulated so far, $77,663,000 supporting 20 different legal nonprofits who are, who are coordinating actions for these Soros prosecutors. To show how bold these people are, Greg, 65 of these Soros prosecutors signed a Soros statement agreeing to ignore any laws restricting abortion. Another 63 signed a public statement saying that they're going to disregard laws against chemical castration and genital mutilation of children. What does that tell you about the legal system today?
That it's broken. And, I've been arguing ad nauseum how broken the legal system is. George Soros is a multi-billionaire who I think hates America and wants to tear it down. He portrays himself as a criminal justice warrior. He's a guy who has too much money. And he's used that money to try to dramatically alter the criminal justice system. And as you described it, a total of $117 million. He's basically bought 126 prosecutors, 30% of the population. You're to be commended, by the way, Brent, for digging through all of the paperwork. And Soros set up this Open Society Foundation, which is the most opaque I've ever seen. A complex web of 527s and charities and other organizations with a deliberate attempt to conceal and to hide what he's doing. Now, one wonders what's Soros' motivation in picking all of these far left, liberal, progressive district attorneys who have ruined their own communities. He believes that if you let people out of jail, if you don't prosecute criminals, you are benefiting minorities and disadvantaged people in the inner city, and therefore, and this is the key part, it will improve public safety. Now, you'd have to be a moron to believe that, because it's not only counterintuitive, it makes no common sense. And empirical and statistical evidence show that the opposite is true, which invites the question, is his real motivation to, create chaos and tear down American society? I can't answer that question. I can't get in his head. But there's a common denominator here with all of these prosecutors that he has plucked to run for office. And a great many of them, he has funded 90% of their fundraising campaigns, as you point out and verify in your report. And the common denominator is they're all criminal defense attorneys and public defenders, right? Who hate prosecutions and prosecutors. So he's flipped it, and he's turned them into the prosecutors.
Yeah.
And they've signed a pledge to his agenda. And the agenda is really twofold. deprosecution, which means we're not going to prosecute a lot of people, or we will drop murder to manslaughter and grand larceny to petty theft and so forth and let people go, put them on probation or no probation at all. They just get to walk scot-free. The other prong is called decarceration. In other words, argue for the most lenient sentence, and when people are up for parole, we won't oppose their parole. George Gascon famously has done that in Los Angeles. The net result, of course, is in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, Boston, St. Louis, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Portland, where all of these Soros-funded progressive prosecutors have been in office. It has been calamitous. You know, these are prosecutors who don't care about the innocent victims of crime. They only care about helping the criminals. They are the criminals' BFFs, and the criminals love it. You know, and the recidivism rate is shocking. You know, once they're released, they go out and recommit the same crime, sometimes even worse. Now, the good news is that in places like San Francisco and Portland and, you know, in Philadelphia and Chicago, these prosecutors are gone. You know, Chesa Boudin, has to be in the history of America the most liberal prosecutor. He didn't want to prosecute anybody. You know, whose parents were domestic terrorists, by the way. He got kicked out of office on a recall. George Gascon in Los Angeles, my hometown, narrowly survived 2 recalls. Kim Foxx called it quits. Krasner, others, you know, some have resigned under pressure. Others have simply been primaried or decided not to run again. Why? Because the citizens have revolted amid the skyrocketing crimes of homicide and rape and assault and battery and theft. But a lot of people have fled those very cities because of what George Soros has done.
Yeah, you know, I think it's interesting. A twofold thing. One is the last thing you said, and then I'm going to comment on the first thing you said. When you talk about the state of cities and the lawlessness that's taken place around the United States, this is something that Kamala Harris can't escape, I think. And if Donald Trump makes an issue of this, she can't walk away from it because people see it every day and have to live through it every day. The other one's inflation. She can she can say all the things they want to, and I think the Republicans can say, well, did you know that you took food and energy out of that inflation data that's being given? The bottom line is that any mother who goes to the store to buy groceries for her family is appalled by what she has to pay. Every man who drives a truck to work and goes to the gas pump and sees he's paying double what he was paying under Donald Trump could care less about that inflation data. So I think in a real way, it doesn't resonate to the degree Donald Trump talks about it and to the degree the media cover it. Now, I want to go back to the first thing you said. It was a bit of a jarring statement. You said George Soros hates America. And a reason it resonates with me, Greg, you've covered politics as a legal analyst, as a reporter. It's been in your life's blood. You've seen how the left has moved over the years. I think you'll agree with me that you could once take the most left-wing radical Democrat, whether it was George McGovern in 1972, whether it was Teddy Kennedy, whoever it might be, but you never, ever called that person anti-American. That was a slur. That was a personal insult. They might have a vision that you didn't like, but they had a vision of America. I think today, Greg, what you said was correct. They are anti-American. I do believe the far left does hate America. I do believe Black Lives Matter does hate America. Antifa does hate America. George Soros does hate America. And I believe at the end of the day, Kamala Harris hates America too. I think at the very end of the day, she just doesn't like this country. They like the idea of critical race theory because it teaches a new generation that this was not a good country. And they love 1619 because it gives an alternative to 1776, a different country we can have, other than this slave-based nation that's so faulty and so disreputable. Am I wrong?
No, I think you've described it quite eloquently. I've never understood how people who have benefited so tremendously, like George Soros, from America and America's system of capitalism and free enterprise. He's a multi-billionaire. He was a hedge fund guy. He was a financier. And how you could benefit from a country and then turn against it by advocating and funding policies that are so obviously destructive. And, he ignores, as does Kamala Harris, a fundamental truth. And you don't have to be a lawyer to know this truth. Common sense tells us. And that is, when you don't prosecute criminals, crime soars. Now, that's quite obvious. We've known it historically and empirically. And yet that's the sort of thing that Soros is advocating and has been advocating. And Kamala Harris is not far behind. When she was a prosecutor in California, she seemed to care more about sanctuary cities. And instead of, enforcing laws. And, I think people need to examine her record because, in politics and in advertising and marketing, lying is endemic. So she'll run all of these ads that are deceptive and dishonest. And I think it's up to the Republican Party and others and the Trump campaign to try to set the record straight. Now, they have a Herculean challenge in front of them. And whether they can do it in the time remaining, I just don't know, because in some places, early voting begins in a couple of weeks, Brent. So, you couldn't have set up a better scenario for Kamala because she didn't have to go through the invasive vetting process of primaries, where, she's actually examined for her statements, for her policies, for her agenda, for her record. She didn't have any of that. And as I said before, she never received a single vote. She was just anointed. And then, of course, the slavishly lazy legacy media, they're all on board. She is their favored candidate. And it does demonstrate how powerful that media is by simply looking at the poll numbers. She was sort of a joke as vice president, chronically incompetent, engaged in word salads, couldn't think with that brain of hers, somebody who flunked the bar exam in California. I mean, she had a staff of people. She must have set a record in Washington, D.C. They all quit.
And 90%.
Go ahead.
It was 90%. Well, but we have a new study that's just been released about your industry. And I'd like you to comment on this. Stuart Varney, your colleague Stuart Varney, and I did an interview the other day, and he asked me when I thought the honeymoon would end, the media honeymoon would end. And I suggested to him it's not going to. It's going to go through the election because it has to, because any serious examination of Kamala Harris could be devastating for the very reasons you brought up. And what's interesting is you're not putting a negative spin on this. You're simply telling the facts that would be reported were it a Republican in this situation. But the numbers that we showed, we looked at the network coverage on ABC, CBS, and NBC from July 21st, when Biden dropped out, to the present, to see how they're covering Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Harris, 84% positive. Donald Trump, 88% negative. Surprise! I mean, how blatant is this? Well, explain to me how you must feel as a journalist. I mean, you know these other journalists, and in some cases, they're old friends of yours. How does it feel knowing that yours is the only network, and Newsmax too, that are giving a full picture, whereas everyone else is deliberately not covering? It's not Kamala Harris who hasn't done a press conference in 3 weeks or 4 weeks. That, to me, is the jarring thing. It is that the media haven't reported about Kamala Harris in that period of time. They don't need her to do a press conference to report on her position on all these issues. So I think they kind of skate when they say that she hasn't done a press conference. I mean, how do you feel about your own colleagues?
Yeah, I think it's embarrassing, it's shameful, it's disgusting. I'm disgusted with them. And, it's almost regrettable that I'm a member of the media and have been for the better part of, 35, 40 years. I got into it. I was a trial lawyer, defense attorney in San Francisco, and I got into television news and journalism because I thought it was an honorable profession. And maybe it was back then, but it isn't anymore. And your statistics that you just cited, upwards of 80% favorable coverage of Kamala by the national media and, 80% negative against Donald Trump speaks volumes. The media at some point in time, and I think it was when Donald Trump walked down the escalator in 2015, he was running for president for the first time. They suddenly got an acute case of Trump derangement syndrome. And instead of being fair and objective or a reasonable approximation thereto, they became overt and covert advocates, cheerleaders for any opponent against Donald Trump. And they became anti-Trumpers, and they wear it on their sleeves. It slants their stories. It affects the stories they choose to cover and the way they cover them. And it is so obvious and transparent to anybody who's paying attention. And yet it has such a direct and often subtle influence on people's beliefs that they don't even know that they're being influenced that way by the national media, because you have to be terribly informed to recognize it. And people are busy with their lives, raising their kids and, supporting the family and so forth. They can't devote the kind of time that you and I do to examining candidates and issues. Yeah, and so they can be easily persuaded, if not fooled. And I think they're in the process of being fooled.
We could have another conversation for a long time about where the news media are going, but we just looked at a survey that the Pew Center did, and people are going all over the place to get their information. One of the numbers that really struck me was 15% of the public is now deciding who to vote for based on Google searches. And we've seen how Google is now has been playing with the algorithms on Republican candidates for several years now, deliberately burying them on page 2 where nobody goes. And I think there should be a congressional investigation into that. Well, let me leave it with this, Greg. I have a rule of thumb on gauging the value of anyone or anything. I ask the simple question, where would the world be without that person, without that thing? And when I think of you and your colleagues at Fox and what Fox News is doing. And I look at these numbers. It would be maybe 95% who didn't know, or 99% who didn't know the answers to these questions, because you folks are the only ones who have, you're not putting a conservative spin on it. You're simply reporting news when you report this. So I commend you for that. I thank you for that. I think this country owes you folks a great debt of gratitude for what you've done. And anyway, just wanted to thank you. Thanks for coming on.
Well, listen, I'm a big admirer of yours, the great work you do at your center. This report, I think, is blockbuster about George Soros. I think everybody needs to know about it and read it. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, sincerely.
Take care.